With a heavy, bone-rattling thud, the colossal timber platform of the Pillar of Calem finally met the floor of the valley. The groaning chains above went slack, sending a shuddering wave through the iron guardrails as the mountain breeze died away, replaced by the suffocating stench of wet earth, iron, and distant wood smoke. They had arrived at the staging grounds. Across the lowlands, a sea of hundreds of fires burned beneath the dark horizon, their thick, choking smoke twisting upward into the starless night. Armorers hurried through the narrow thoroughfares between long rows of war tents, the frantic clatter of iron and whetstones creating a steady, chaotic rhythm. Tethered nearby, war horses stamped their hooves against the frosted earth, snorting anxiously as they caught the bitter scent of sulfur and blood on the wind. Somewhere far beyond the flickering periphery of the torchlight, deep, guttural war horns rolled heavily across the valley floor, a chilling prelude that sent a cold shudder through the waiting host. Before the dust could settle, a small vanguard of high elven commanders strode through the swirling mist to meet them, their polished silver plate catching the fierce orange glow of the surrounding campfires. One figure separated himself from the waiting commanders. At their head was Commander Valen, a veteran whose scarred jaw and grim eyes bore the quiet weight of a lifetime spent defending the passes. He bowed low, his fist pressed over his chest-piece in silent reverence to the returned prince, though his eyes burned with urgent intensity. "My prince, Lady Adora," Valen greeted, his voice cutting through the distant rumble of moving armor. "The high lines have formed. 300 of our folk, bowstrings and spears, stand assembled at the mouth of the pass, ready to hold the northern choke point." He turned, gesturing toward the shadowy expanse of the lowlands where the fires of men flickered in a vast, organized grid. "General Tormund's forces have already executed their deployment," Valen continued, his finger tracing a line toward the dark, jagged ridges to the west. "He has divided his command. Half of his armored host has joined our main line to reinforce our shields against the initial charge. The remaining half a full division of Nostrudor heavy cavalry and shock infantry has slipped into the western ravines under cover of the dark." Valen met Rian's gaze, a grim, calculated victory gleaming in his eyes. "When the enemy crashes against our combined front, Tormund will send word to spring the trap from the west. He intends his men to sweep down from the high ridges, catching the northern horde in a brutal pincer and driving them directly against the unforgiving cliffs of the eastern shores." Rian looked out toward the dark horizon, feeling the weight of thousands of lives waiting on a single command. He reached down, his thumb brushing the rough grass charm tucked beneath his breastplate, before looking over at Adora. The name she had whispered on the platform, Umbara, still hung like a phantom shroud between them. But as the war drums of the lowlands began their steady, thunderous beat, there was no longer any room for hesitation. Rian walked among the lines, his boots sinking into the churned earth, his gaze drifting over the men of Nostrudor as they made their final preparations for war. They wore the same dark, battered plate. They bore the same heavy iron pauldrons, scarred by old steel and pitted with rust. Even their faces, bearded, grime-streaked, and hardened by years of harsh winters, looked agonizingly identical to the soldiers who had patrolled the cobbled streets of the false city. Every clank of their boots, every quiet curse muttered over a dull blade, sent a cold, sickly spike of familiarity straight into his chest. For a terrifying, breathless second, the fires around him dimmed. The neat rows of tents blurred, the smell of pine vanished. Cobbled streets threatened to replace the churned earth beneath his boots. Somewhere beyond the soldiers, he thought he heard the familiar creak of a market square windmill, threatening to drag him back into the quiet nightmare of Umbara's illusion. A suffocating weight settled over his ribs. He realized then, with a quiet and bitter certainty, that the horror would never truly leave him. The paranoia, the creeping doubt that the world around him was merely another layer of an elaborate cage, was a scar carved too deeply into his mind ever fully to fade. Rian forced his jaw to set, drawing in a slow, icy breath of real mountain air, tasting the sharp tang of pitch and sweat. He couldn't afford to drown in the dark. He had to live with it, carry the ghost, and fight anyway. He had to trust that the raw, agonizing truth of his scars, the cold bite of the wind, and the undeniable weight of the blade in his hands would always be enough to anchor him, to separate the living world from the dreams that had sought to break him. Near the edge of the staging grounds, a silence hung thick between two encampments, sharp and fragile as drawn glass. An elven spearman, his slender frame draped in polished silver scales, stood rigidly beside a stack of fletched ash arrows. Just paces away, a burly Nostrudor shield-bearer squatted on an overturned wooden crate, methodically running a heavy whetstone down the edge of his broadsword. Neither spoke. The air between them hummed with the ghosts of 100 past skirmishes of grandfathers who had bled on opposing sides of the border and ancient grudges that had poisoned the mountain passes for generations. The human paused his whetstone, casting a sidelong glance at the elf's light, ornate armor. "That thin silver won't turn an inimicus war-pick, lad," the soldier rumbled, his voice like grinding stones, breaking the tension with a gruff, uninvited bluntness. "You'll be opened up before the first line even collapses." The elven spearman didn't flinch, but his grip tightened fractionally around his ash shaft. He turned his cold, starlit eyes toward the human's scarred broadsword and battered iron plate. "It is forged to move with the wind, Lowlander," the elf replied, his tone low and laced with ancient pride. "While your heavy iron buries you in the mud, our steel ensures we are never where the blow lands." The human let out a harsh, barking laugh. Though there was no malice in it, only the dry humor of a man who knew he might die before dawn. He reached into his leather belt pouch, pulled out a small horn of harsh, spiced northern spirits, and took a long swig. He held it out toward the elf. "Then I'll keep the mud off your boots, elf," the man growled, offering a crooked, missing-toothed grimace. "If you keep those arrows flying over my head—" The elf looked down at the scratched horn, then up at the human's grime-caked face. For a heartbeat, the weight of centuries of hatred teetered on a needle's edge. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, the elf stepped forward and took the horn. He took a short, sharp sip, wincing slightly at the burn, before handing it back. "Deal, human of Nostrador." No vows of eternal brotherhood were spoken, nor were old wounds magically healed. But as the distant war drums thundered across the dark, two ancient enemies turned back to their weapons, bound by the quiet, unyielding truth that tonight they stood shoulder to shoulder against the extinction of both their bloodlines. Rian watched the quiet exchange from the shadow of a supply wagon, a faint breath escaping him as the elf handed the spirit horn back to the soldier. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was the first crack in a wall that had stood for centuries. "Do you think they'll ever truly trust one another?" Rian asked quietly, his eyes lingering on the two warriors as they returned to their weapons. Adora stepped up beside him, her bow blade resting comfortably against her shoulder as her gaze swept across the fractured, tension-filled camp. "Not today," she replied softly, her voice carrying a steady, timeless weight. "Nor tomorrow. The wounds of 100 wars do not mend over a single cup of spirits." She looked at Rian, her eyes reflecting the crimson glow of the nearby fires. "But tonight," she said, her gaze drifting back to the campfires, "they would lay down their lives for one another." She looked back at him, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. "For now, Prince, that is enough." It did not take them long to reach the vanguard at the head of the column. A formal battle formation had not yet been drawn, but the air was thick with readiness. Soldiers stood in guarded silence, fists resting on weapon hilts and ears strained toward the dark. Further north, where the lowlands dissolved into impenetrable gloom, thin silhouettes stood scattered along the horizon like silent sentinels. They were the forward scouts, elves, and men stationed every few paces, their ink-stained fingers moving frantically as they scribbled observations onto rolls of heavy parchment. One of the elven scouts, catching sight of the prince as he approached the front, broke away from his post. He hurried through the lines, coming to a sudden, breathless halt before Rian, bowing his head in swift, martial reverence. "My prince," the scout panted, his chest heaving under his light leather armor. "It warms the heart to see you standing amongst our kin once more." Without waiting for ceremony, the scout pressed a rolled parchment into Rian's hands. Rian unrolled the rough sheet, holding it wide so Adora could read the hasty charcoal lines over his shoulder. What am I looking at? Rian asked, his brow furrowing as his eyes traced the jagged lines and symbols mapped across the page. The scout hesitated, a flash of awkward confusion crossing his features before panic seized him. He jolted forward, stepping closer to point at a heavily cross-hatched region near the upper border. "Forgive me, sir. I forgot your mind is, well." Adora let out a sharp, decisive cough, cutting the scout off before the lingering shadow of Rian's stolen past could darken the moment. The scout flinched, quickly refocusing on the map. "From our perches, we can confirm the northern reaches of Aethelgard are ablaze," the elf explained hastily, his finger pressing hard against a charcoal mark. "Not that those barren crags held much to begin with, but the fires have now crept into our high hunting forests, just east of the Bone Wastes." Rian and Adora looked up from the parchment, their eyes tracking the northern horizon. Sure enough, dark, suffocating plumes of ash were billowing into the moonlight, bleeding from the exact valley the scout had indicated. "That is a severe blow," Adora said, her voice tightening with immediate concern as she looked at the smoke. "If those flames spread any further south, it will starve our meat supply before the first snow falls." The scout gave a somber nod, his grim expression mirrored in the flickering firelight. "Our allies from the west sent word as well," he added, his tone dropping to a low murmur. "The enemy has halted their advance on the capital. For now. It seems they banked on the men of Nostrudor abandoning Aethelgard entirely to defend their own keep. But their ilk isn't blind. Their watchers must have spotted our lines and reported back that our numbers have been bolstered by legions of men." The scout shot a sharp, appraising glance toward a nearby battalion of Nostrudor infantry who were hammering an iron stake into the frozen turf. "At least the lowlanders will prove useful for once," the elf muttered under his breath, a faint, wry smirk briefly cracking his serious demeanor. Rian and Adora exchanged a silent, exasperated look, both shaking their heads at the quiet rivalry that still pulsed beneath the alliance. Passing the rough parchment back into the scout's hands, Rian held the soldier's gaze. "Thank you. Return to your post," Rian commanded softly. "At once, my prince." The scout bowed, turning on his heel and darting back into the misty gloom toward the northern horizon. Beyond the scout's perches, the northern waste stretched into absolute suffocating quiet. The battlefield ahead looked eerily desolate and foreboding, wrapped in a blanket of creeping fog that swallowed the moonlight whole. Far in the gloom, subtle shifts of distant firelight peered through the thick mists like the hungry, glowing eyes of lurking beasts. There was no thunder of marching boots, no clash of iron, only the hollow, howling breath of the wind. Rian and Adora stood side by side, their eyes locked onto the shrouded horizon. "What are they waiting for?" Rian asked softly, his fingers idly brushing the sigil on his sword hilt. "They have the numbers. They set the fires, so why pause now?" Adora's jaw remained set, her sharp eyes scanning the shifting smoke for any sign of movement. "I don't know," she admitted, the rare confession heavy with tension. "And that is what worries me. An enemy that waits is an enemy with a plan." Rian stared into the gloom a moment longer. Then, without a word, he unclasped his sword belt slightly, lowered himself to the frozen turf, and sat down flat on the cold ground right between two bustling encampments of soldiers. Adora paused. She stopped mid-scan, slowly lowering her gaze to find the Prince of Aethelgard sitting casually in the dirt while two armies stood braced for slaughter. "What in the high peaks are you doing?" she asked, her brow furrowing in sheer disbelief. Rian looked up at her, exhaling a long, weary breath. "My armor is heavy." Adora let out a sudden, bright laugh, a sound so jarringly light against the oppressive gloom that a nearby human soldier looked over in surprise. She shook her head, muttering something incoherent under her breath about stubborn royalty. For a few long moments, she remained standing, her posture rigid as she tried to maintain her vigilant guard over him. But as the wind whipped another icy gust across the valley, her shoulders finally relaxed. With a silent surrender, she unstrung her bow blade and sank beside him into the dirt, her steel-clad knees pulled up to her chest. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the misty horizon, desperately trying not to notice the faint, victorious smirk slowly forming on Rian's face beside her. Adora watched from the corner of her eye as the quiet satisfaction on Rian's face abruptly vanished. His hands scrambled frantically over his chest piece, his fingers digging into the gaps of his heavy plate, searching, pulling at his collar with a sudden rising panic. She turned her full attention to him, her brows drawing together in concern. "Rian, what's wrong? What is it?" "Garth's necklace," Rian muttered, his voice tightening as his breathing grew shallow and hurried. He patted down his waist belt, his shoulders hunching as he searched every buckle and strap. "I can't find it. Adora, it's not here." Adora opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but as she looked closely at his bare neck and the empty notch over his collarbone, the truth hit her like a splash of glacial water. The carved bone pendant, the one he had worn every single day since Garth had fallen, was gone. "Rian, stop," she said gently, reaching out to catch his trembling hands. "Listen to me. It wasn't stolen." Rian froze, his dark eyes wide and vulnerable as he looked at her. "When we brought you back from the city, you were grimy," she explained softly, her thumb rubbing the side of his cold knuckle. "The mountain healers cleaned you down and redressed you. They were meticulous, Rian. They would have secured every piece of your personal gear and put it in safekeeping before they began. It's safely stowed in the upper chambers." Rian's shoulders slowly sank, the frantic energy draining out of him all at once. He let his hands fall to his sides, staring down at the frozen earth beneath his boots. "I wish I had it," he whispered, the loss settling heavily into his chest. "I feel like I left him behind." Adora's expression softened with an aching tenderness. She leaned her arm against her knee, looking out toward the thousands of fires burning across the valley. The combined host of elves and men sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark. "You didn't leave him behind," she said, a faint, nostalgic smile touching her lips. "And if he were here right now, standing in the mud with 300 elven archers and a horde of lowlanders waiting to smash a dark legion?" She let out a soft, breathy chuckle, her eyes reflecting the distant firelight. He would have loved every single second of this. He would have already picked a fight with 3 different Nostrudor captains, won all their spirits in a dice game, and spent the last hour complaining that his bowstring was damp. A genuine, albeit melancholic laugh broke from Rian's throat. The tightness in his chest eased just a fraction as the image of his loud, unyielding friend took shape in his mind. "He would have complained about the cold, too," Rian added softly. "Oh, bitterly," Adora agreed, her smile lingering as she looked back at him. "He's here, Rian. You don't need a piece of bone around your neck to carry him into this fight. He's in every arrow we lose tonight." The fragile warmth of Garth's memory dissolved instantly, swallowed by a chilling, sudden shift in the air. To the north, the swirling mists parted. Out of the suffocating gloom, a single, solitary figure materialized, stepping onto the frosty turf with eerie, silent grace. The reaction across the vanguard was instantaneous. The quiet hushed into a wire-tight tension as every single soldier along the front lines jumped to attention. Heavy tower shields slammed together with a deafening collective crack, forming an impenetrable wall of iron and silver against the dark. Adora bolted to her feet in a heartbeat, her hand locked onto Rian's arm, hauling him up beside her with fierce protective urgency. But as Rian rose, a sudden hum echoed through the dark recesses of his mind. A silent but magnetic pull, an overwhelming compulsion he could neither name nor fight, took root in his core, commanding his limbs. Rian took a step forward, then another, and another. "Rian, stop!" Adora hissed, her hand slipping from his sleeve as he moved past her shield. "Step back, now!" "It's okay," Rian murmured, his voice sounding distant, almost hollow, as if he were answering a call only he could hear. Adora's jaw snapped shut. Seeing he would not yield, her warrior instinct surged to the surface. She pivoted on her heel, her bow blade snapping into place as she barked a thunderous command to the ranks behind them. "Archers, knock your arrows! Draw and aim release on my signal!" Across the forward lines, dozens of bowstrings groaned in unison, a lethal forest of red-feathered shafts rising to target the mist. Behind them, hushed, anxious voices rippled through the ranks of men and elves alike, a rising murmur of raw curiosity and nervous dread as they watched their prince walk unprotected into the open expanse. The figure in the gloom matched Rian's momentum, advancing at the same pace, silently mirroring every step he took. It was a terrifying, synchronized dance. Rian finally slowed his pace, halting just a few meters from the stranger. The fog still clung heavily to the figure's form, obscuring their face and features in dense shadows, but standing this close, there was no mistaking the shape. It was a humanoid creature, wrapped in a suffocating, unnatural stillness that sent a wave of absolute frost radiating across the valley. "It is good to see you again, Rian," a voice uttered from the shadowy figure, its smooth tone drifting through the frozen mist like a whisper from a half-remembered dream. Rian's breath hitched. A strange spark flared behind his temples. "I know you, don't I?" he asked, the words leaving his lips before he could stop them. "I should hope so," the figure replied softly. As Rian's eyes began to adjust to the dim, shifting light of the lowlands, the gloom pulled back just enough to reveal the stranger's form. The figure was clad in dark, heavy plate armor, intricate, masterfully forged, and strangely, mesmerizingly beautiful. Deep indigo robes spilt out from beneath the dark steel, catching the whisper of the northern wind. Atop their head sat a sleek, dark helm that entirely concealed their face, leaving only a narrow slit where a pair of bright, piercing blue eyes burned in the dark. Rian stared deeply into those eyes. Something about them resonated with him, striking a chord deep within the hollow, broken spaces of his mind. Behind him, he could faintly hear the sharp, anxious calls of Adora and the muffled, rising shouts of the soldiers begging him to fall back. But the noise felt distant, like muffled thunder beyond a mountain wall. He ignored them completely. Driven by an irresistible pull, Rian took another step closer. The figure mirrored him seamlessly, stepping forward in return. Rian knew this moment was entirely wrong. Every piece of logic warned him that standing in the open before the northern horde was madness. Yet beneath the rising terror, there was something strangely familiar, almost comforting, in the figure's presence and voice, a warmth that defied the biting cold around them. "It has been too long," the figure said, his posture noticeably relaxing, the sharp, defensive tension vanishing from his shoulders. "We were so close to one another, but fate willed our meeting to be now, it seems." Rian swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly at his sides as he looked upon the dark armor. "Who are you?" he asked once again, his voice barely a whisper above the wind. "Tell me who you are." He looked into the eyes of the figure once more, searching the dark, narrow gap of the helm. The ground beneath him seemed to shift. Peering into those bright, piercing blue eyes made him feel as though he were staring directly into a mirror, for the brilliant, unyielding blue burning beneath that dark visor was an exact, breathtaking reflection of his own. Rian studied the figure more closely, his gaze dropping to the dark, intricate plate. The stranger seemed to be completely unarmed, no blade at his hip, no bow slung across his back. The realization sent a sharp spike of confusion through Rian. Surely, if this was an agent of the enemy, a tool of Umbara, cutting down the Prince of Aethelgard before the eyes of the combined host would be the ultimate blow to break their spirit. Yet the figure stood in absolute stillness. "I am surprised you do not recognize me by my voice," the figure said, his hands rising slowly to the clasps of his dark helm. With a soft, metallic click, he lifted the helmet away. A scruffy cascade of shoulder-length brown hair fell free, framing the striking face of an elven man. Beautiful, with sharp, regal features and a light dusting of stubble across his jawline. Instantly the world seemed to tilt beneath Rian's boots. His eyes widened in sheer, paralyzing panic, the blood draining from his face. A sudden, violent shock of wonder and suffocating pain tore through his chest, shattering the quiet numbness in his mind as the figure softly finished his sentence. "Son." Rian's breath choked in his throat, staring back at him through the gloom, alive, breathing. Looking upon him with a sorrowful warmth was his father Hothan. The face was undeniable. It was the exact, undeniable likeness of the grand stone statue Rian had stood before in the mountain sanctuary only hours ago, carved to honor a dead hero. But the cold stone had never possessed those piercing blue eyes, the very eyes Rian now stared into, frozen in absolute disbelief, as the northern wind howled between them.